Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all having a lovely middle to your week. I'm going to talk today, as just explained, briefly on trustworthiness, and robotics and AI. So if I move to my first slide. So my research falls under this term, discipline agnostic robotics. Basically, I've worked in robotics disciplines as diverse as biomimetics, nuclear maintenance and handling. I've done a lot of socio-robotics. I've worked with industrial robot manipulators and AI systems. And this breadth of discipline application means that I have worked with very diverse users as well in lots of different uncertain, unknown and risky environments. I've kind of learned that the goal of any deployed advanced technology, therefore, is to be consistently able to deliver reliable outcomes in repeated sessions, kind of irrespective of context. And that's often how we define what it is to be considered a trustworthy piece of technology. We ask ourselves, how reliable is it in its given context? However, testing a system that involves human-robot interaction at the development stage and also the deployment stage highlights how reliability of the technology itself is not the only way to understand whether a piece of technology is trustworthy or not. In fact, it's the repeated issues that I have found in attempting to replicate trustworthiness in development versus in situ evaluations that's led to my exploring new ways to understand these key evaluation concepts within robotics and AI, or RAI, as I'll be calling it in this talk, research. My current work is focused on helping to improve this disconnect in results seen in tests conducted in various stages of the RAI development cycle. So that's what I'm going to talk about briefly today, these patterns of failures that I've seen across all of these disparate scenarios and how I've been putting them together to conceive of them in a singular novel way of assessing HRI studies to avoid those failures. I'm going to take a moment to clarify how I'm using the words trust and trustworthiness. So in my current home discipline of computer science, we divide these words by what is a subjectively thought about concept of trust that a person might have as an individual versus a set of qualities that a thing might have that would deem it trustworthy or not. It's a useful definition in the field of verification of autonomous systems and their subsequent standardization, as a focus on trustworthiness allows us to look for variables that we can confirm do or do not exist. So as we see on this slide, which I've borrowed from my colleague Michael Fisher, who's also at Manchester University, trust can be seen as subjective, and then systems can be designed to be objectively trustworthy based on some system essentiality measurements like reliability, beneficiality, transparency, whether or not it's verifiable. And then you can expand out to more nebulous concepts like whether or not things such as the appearance of a piece of advanced technology plays a role in its perception of these system essential trustworthiness qualities. So, given this, then, my thinking is that as robots or AI systems are not deployed in isolation as a singular item of technology, they're not being deployed outside of human society. What do we actually mean when we ask ourselves whether or not a robot or a piece of AI software is to be trusted or is trustworthy? Are we just referring to the technology itself, or are we, individual people, the public, governments, groups of society, referring to the whole system that exists around and includes the piece of technology and is therefore facilitating the deployment of said technology? So, with trust and trustworthiness, therefore, being such nebulous words, but also words being used across advanced technology discourse, I've tried to capture the practical issues which can be measured under the guise of exploring trust in robotics and AI. So if my goal is to make RAI more trustworthy and by extension make it better and safer for the user, my approach to analysing all these bits of technologies begins by asking, in each technology specific context, how do we ensure those technologies and the people involved in using them are not only trustworthy, by whatever measure we're defining that as, but also these words around how we're defining trustworthiness, such as transparent and understandable and explainable. So what we're seeing on this slide is what I've seen across all of the different studies I've done in all of these different areas. You've got robots that should work well because they've achieved excellent pre-deployed scores in batteries of studies and tests. But then they often fail to reach those scores again once they're put into their final context. And something is happening between initial testing and deployment of technologies that shifts whether or not it's being used. And a lot of that seems to point towards this word trustworthiness without really understanding what that is. So let me explain. For example, take essential decommissioning robotics. So despite all the engineering excellence that we have within decommissioning at the moment, we're finding that the advanced technology solutions that we develop are never really effectively deployed in the required timeframes. So we've got problems with cultures of control within the field, as well as hesitation around different psychosocial trust in the human hierarchies within the workplace that appear to actually be the central challenge that goes unaddressed in these large-scale engineering issues that are especially pertinent in particularly hazardous engineering deployment scenarios. So you've got all these resources funneled into development that then seem to be a waste of resources when things just end up being failed to use at the end. Healthcare robotics is another very good example where we see enormous capital investment up front with machines that kind of end up as nothing more than glorified coat hangers once they're placed in clinics. So this is something that I studied and wrote about with my colleague CJ Hasson, who you can see in this picture on a treadmill. So we were over in Northeastern's College of Health Sciences, looking at how remote operated rehabilitation robots could effectively work if deployed into clinics. And this was based on both of our independent experiences before we'd met each other and started working together of rehabilitation robotics that have been invested in and built and designed and then put into clinics and then never used because they failed at doing things like understanding the basic biomechanics of human beings and how rehabilitation can't just be a repetitive motion, needs to involve a lot more diversity, just kind of basic questions that if you'd asked any PT, you'd kind of understand before. We're talking millions in capital investment. So across all these different domains, then we're getting time and again a pattern of disconnect between the design and development of technology and then its subsequent deployment in the real world. I'll get to why all this is to do with trustworthiness soon. Hopefully it will start to make more sense. So the idea being then, we don't want any of that resource waste, right? It's important that before the design and build begins, before we get to failure at deployment, we need a way to understand all those nuances around trust and how that plays out as technology is inserted into daily and working lives. But how do we do that? And why am I using this word trust so much? And what's going on that leads to all of these endpoint unusable robotics? So you can kind of sum that up by saying, why is it that some technologies fail at being seen as trustworthy to the extent that they go unused? And why do I argue that that is in part rooted in mediating human interactions? So I'm going to read a couple of statements that will clarify how this all comes together. And then I'm going to give you an example of what this all means. So a cornerstone of trust in robotics and AI is this discussion of responsibility and this concept of transparency. It is much harder to use and especially trust a robotic system or any advanced system or technology or even colleagues or a pen or a bottle, anything that has an opaque decision-making process. The simpler something is, the easier it is to understand what happens when it is used. When things get more complex, it becomes harder and harder to understand what is going to happen when it is used. Without knowing, especially who is going to be responsible for that outcomes of that use, whether or not you can trust not only the piece of technology, but the people around you that have given you that technology to use starts to break down. And that's why trust is so key to this question of what's going on between development and deployment. We want to be able to trust technological systems in the sense that we can rely on them not to work against our interests. And we need to do that by understanding that a technological system also includes the people building, deploying, and using it. It's the ecosystem that is extending beyond the technology. So I'm going to take a step back from robotics altogether to give you an example that will hopefully highlight this even more simply. So imagine a friend has given you a therapist recommendation, one that they think you might benefit from seeing, somebody that they've been to recently, who's really helped them through some kind of mental health scenario. Maybe it's an occupational health thing with work. You talk to them about it and you trust your friend and you like your friend and you see how much this therapy has helped them and you ask them for who they saw, and then you go along to that therapist's office and you speak to them in good faith and you're having a really good interaction that's kind of open, and you go back to your friend afterward and say, thank you so much, I can see why you trusted this doctor so much, that was great. Thank you. So now compare that interaction with a therapist that your employer has recommended that you speak to. And perhaps this recommendation has come at a time when you're aware that your employers are looking to make redundancies. So maybe your employers come in one day and said, I see that everyone's struggling with work. We've decided to give everyone some free therapy. Crack on. But whilst everyone's aware of these rumblings about redundancies, it might be exactly the same therapist. You go along to the same clinic, you sit with the same person. The therapist has exactly the same toolkit that they did in scenario A. But now, the way that you're talking to the therapist is not going to be in the same good faith as it might have been in scenario A. So, in this scenario, the therapist is a tool that we are using to help ourselves. And you're treating that tool differently in scenario A and B based on the relationship with the authority that instigated the interaction that you are having with that therapist tool. And now, if you replace therapist tool with robot or autonomous system tool, I hope it becomes clearer how the dynamics of the deployment of the tool then mediates how much we interact with them and how much we trust them and how much transparency we believe we're getting from them and how much we understand their intentions and goals, and whether or not we rely on them, and by them I mean the interaction with it, not to work against our interests. I've seen this a lot in a lot of studies that I've done, wherein it's quite difficult to parse out when you ask someone, do you trust this piece of technology, whether or not when they say yes or no, they're actually talking about the technology or everything else around the use of the technology that makes them feel uncomfortable. If robotics and AI, therefore, is this tool can be used to mediate all of these human dynamics that are going around it. I'm given a tool, therefore, by an authority, maybe my employer, maybe my doctor, and that tool then has the capacity to perhaps monitor me in any way, sense me whilst not being an extension of me. It's involved in the tasks that I'm doing, but I don't know if a task goes wrong, how much it's going to be me culpable or the technology culpable. I don't know how much the authority that's given me that tool is going to blame me for things. What are my legal standings here? So all of these other questions that are flying around, that when you get to the deployment stage and ask yourself, do I trust this piece of technology? The answer becomes a lot trickier to pin down as to do with anything other than to do with anything outside. Wait a minute. To do with just the technology itself. Okay, I've confused myself. I'm going to clear that up with a nice clear triangle because everyone loves triangles. So this is a figure that I call the social triad model. It's from a paper I published a year or so ago with lots of colleagues that involves comparisons of a range of different studies that we've done across different disciplines, but with the same robotic technology, that demonstrates how the resulting outcomes were to do with extra variables that were these mediating human interactions. So in traditional models of human-robot interaction research, we've focused on this dyadic interaction between a user and a machine. But we believe that that misses a key complexity. A robot's perceived trustworthiness may be contingent on the user's relationship with and opinion of the individual or organizations deploying the robot. And this key change to understanding that dynamic is fundamental to solving the issue of this data reproducibility issue within HRI, and therefore solving this issue of accurately addressing how to build trustworthy robotics by understanding where the trust lies, and it's not just within the machine. So this here is what we typically use to define, study, and explore HRI theories. We've got a user, we've got a robot, we've got a little bit of interaction in the middle, and that's the bit we're measuring, and that's the extent of our system and our understanding of the system. But what we did was just add a couple more layers to that understanding. So if we want to understand what is trustworthy or responsible, or what's going on in the use of robotics and all that entails, we expand that traditional model to include the deployer or the mediators. So up the top there, we can include a person or the organization who is seen as responsible for the production of the HRI scenario. So they might have created the robot or the AI system, they might have programmed the robot or the system, they might just have set out the robot's interactions and aims. And then crucially, on the other side, we have the human-human part of the human-human robot interaction. So this is the relationship between our users and the authorities deploying the technology for the users. This is the final mediation pathway that the humans are doing that is impacting that little bit of measured HRI down the bottom that we see changing from an initial development stage and a deployment stage. So that looks like this. And this is the reference for that paper. So now when we ask our HRI scenario questions about responsibility and understandability and all of these terms that we use around trust to try and understand these concepts within robotics and AI, despite the fact that we're still measuring that little bit at the bottom between the robot and the user, as is traditional, we have an idea of all the other pathways that we also need to be exploring to understand what is impacting that measured section down below. So hopefully, the idea is that this framework will give researchers a template for how to measure our data in a way that allows them to account for things that are going to change between development and deployment. So you can start to maybe pre-predict the issues that you might have that are going to alter those initial lovely benchmarking results that we have. So kind of in sum then, a human's relationship with a person or an employer or their government does facilitate the deployment of a piece of robotic or AI technology, and it is not consistent. As such, we should be asking ourselves who is responsible when technology fails, and who perceives who is responsible when technology fails. Is it the employer? Is it the person who deploys it? Is it the user who's been instructed to work with it by the deployer? What's going on with that dynamic? Understanding those trust pathways amongst humans in our system is obviously a step towards answering those initial questions about resource waste, etc., etc. So if responsibility does not lie with the artificial agents themselves, then it's going to be lying with these people who are designing and deploying and developing and manufacturing and then using all of these pieces of technology. Oh, I didn't say this was a simple solution, by the way. I just made things much more complicated. I still also prefer to just sit in my basement and build things and ignore these issues, but so obviously I'm talking about responsibility enough, and I hope that that also highlights that it's understanding how much people know is going to happen with the consequence of use that forms a massive part of how these trust pathways work out between human beings at the end. In sociology, the world is often modelled on this inherently distrustful society in which we exist. And I think that even by acknowledging that we have pathways to trustworthiness within the use of technologies, by sidestepping distrustful institutional systems, we can start to maybe approach a better way of conceiving of building trustworthy technologies. Now, my answer would be to solve this, a practical step is changes in policies, the development of more independent verification bodies. We want to engender objective, trustworthy standards in our technologies. So the questions of who is responsible and what the consequences are don't end up solely reliant on the word of a single company profiting from its sale. Now, I'm not saying that this is a straightforward solution, and also those bodies themselves could also end up being the very same distrustful bodies that these regulation bodies were set up to overcome in the first place. But it's kind of a step forward. And even just acknowledging that the failures of systems based on this nebulous term trust isn't just to do with the technology, I think is just a very important key step, even though that is a pretty big issue. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. These are lots of people I've worked with. Thank you very much.